Hey guys, ShinoBazuxX here, and I am here today to talk to you guys about the July 30th Shrine of Secrets. I'm doing this a little bit late, but I'm basically just going to be going over what perks I think are, well, basically what are the perks in the shrine, how do they work, what do they work good with, and essentially which one would be my pick. I guess we're just going to call this like Shino Shrine pick or something like that. Either way, thank you guys so much for tuning in, and let's get into it. So the first perk we have up in the shrine today is Strider. This is a nurse-centric perk, so it's a perk that you pick up from the nurse. I believe it's one of our first teachables. That being said, if you don't plan on playing nurse or haven't picked up nurse just yet, it'd be a good idea to pick this up from the shrine so you don't have to put points into her until you're ready to play her. Now, essentially what Strider does in its final form is it makes survivors who are injured 50% louder and survivors who are not injured 25% louder. That doesn't necessarily make all of their actions louder, just basically their breathing. If you've ever hit a survivor, you know that they start to like pant a little bit harder and moan a little bit, so it makes them a little easier to spot. This perk basically just increases your ability to be able to hear them in these situations. Strider is a really good perk, but it really shines on killers like Nurse, obviously, since it is one of her perks, as well as Spirit is another killer who can make great use of the perk's ability. The main reason why this perk does so well on Spirit is because, obviously, as you know, when you phase out with Spirit, you're unable to see anything other than maybe scratch marks, so being able to hear where the survivors are going can be extremely useful if you're trying to track a survivor while on the phase state. The only two perks that I would say personally synergize really well with Strider are going to be Whispers and Nurse's Calling. The reason why I say Whispers in general is just one of the strongest killer perks in the game, but as Whispers helps you minimize, or I guess figure out where a survivor is within 32 meters of you, Strider can help you pinpoint that last 16 meters if they've already injured. Generally, if they're within 32 meters, you'll hear them or you'll see them with Whispers, or see the Whispers, and if they're within 16 meters, you'll more than likely hear them with Strider. So you can use the two to try to pinpoint where they are. And the other one I say it works well with would be Nurse's Calling. The reason why I say Nurse's Calling is because generally with Nurse's Calling, you'll see the survivor. If they know it's a nurse or they realize you have Nurse's Calling, a lot of times they'll stop healing and start running. And if they do that, then well, you use the Strider to pinpoint where they are since they're still injured and breathing a lot louder. Now, Strider, again, I don't think is necessarily one of the strongest perks in the game, but it is really useful, especially on Nurse and Spirit. I think currently from what's available in the Shrine, it's probably the best pickup for killing. But we'll get back to tops and bottoms from a little bit later in the pick. Other than that, let's move on. Next up on the killer side of the list, we've got Unnerving Presence. Now, Unnerving Presence is a Trapper teachable. It's one of his first perks that you pick up. And since he's not only come along as like a free part of the game, but is also like probably one of the first killers you'll try out playing, you probably should already have this perk. However, in the off chance you skip leveling Trapper and just played somebody else, I would have to say I don't necessarily recommend spending the shards and picking this one up. My reasoning for that is, although this is technically a perk that can be used on anybody, the only perk really ever truly shines on Doctor and maybe Legion on very specific builds. But outside of that, although it can be used on anybody, I don't think it's really that strong off anybody, even Trapper himself, to be completely frank. That being said, Unnerving Presence does have the most synergies of like almost any other perk in the game, if I'm completely honest. Unnerving Presence, for those who don't know, basically increases the survivor's chance within your terror radius to get a skill check, and making those skill check zones about 60% smaller while within your terror radius. Since everything about this perk is all affected by being in a terror radius, any perks that affect your terror radius, like Distressing or Monitor Abuse, are really good to run with this perk, as well as add-ons are, of course, things like Agitation as well. Other perks that work really well with this would be, say, something like Doctor's Overcharge, which gives the survivors a really hard skill check. This makes that hard skill check even harder. It's like super duper tiny, but this makes that skill check even harder for survivors to hit, thus increasing their chance. They already have a 100% chance of getting the skill check when you use Overcharge, so being inside your terror radius and trying to do it basically makes it impossible. And the last perk I say that I think it synergizes the most with would be Huntress Lullaby. The reason for this is Huntress Lullaby makes skill checks a lot harder for people to hit, and by basically making it like missed timing, but also increases their penalty for missing said skill checks. That being said, being in your terror radius makes it more likely for them to get the skill checks, and the skill checks to be 60% harder, so you can see why this would synergize really well with Huntress Lullaby at pretty much all stages of the game. Now again, personally, although I do really like this perk, the only reason I really like this perk is because Doctor is probably one of my main killers, and I think this perk on Doctor is where it shines the most. The main reason before that is because obviously Doctor's got add-ons that allow him to alter his terror radius, you've got perks that can alter your terror radius, but also more importantly, along with like having the skill checks be smaller, as you guys know of Doctor, when he shocks you or puts you in different levels of madness, it becomes harder to hit skill checks due to the fact that they move back and forth across the screen. Doctor's one of the only killers whose natural power synergizes with this perk, which I think is what makes it so strong on him. If you're going to be playing Doctor or you fancy yourself being a Doctor main, I'd highly recommend picking it up. But because it's so specialized towards him and only kind of okay on everybody else, I couldn't recommend it outside of that. The other thing to keep in mind about Unnerving Presence is the skill check reduction also affects perks like Decisive Strike, so it can be really useful if trying to throw off a survivor if they're going to DS you after you down them. But the Decisive Strike conversation is in another video. Okay, so first up on the survivor side, we've got Calm Spirit, which is one of Jake's natural teachables. It's a second teachable on the web, so it's one he picks up at level 35. Calm Spirit has come a long way from what it was when it was originally introduced. The main purpose of Calm Spirit is to make it less likely for crows to be startled when you walk by them, this preventing you from setting off abilities like Spies from the Shadows, or just having the killer see the birds fly away when you run by them. The other thing that Calm Spirit does is help you resist the urge to scream. So this includes things like Doctor Shock, Clown Gas, Freddy Traps, or even Infectious Fright. Anything that would normally make you scream in the game, you will essentially resist the urge to do that with Calm Spirit. This also includes the scream the survivors let out as they get hit. Now, when coupled with things like Jake's other perk, Iron Will, can be used really to, I guess you could say, really high effect versus killers like Nurse or Spirit, who rely very heavily on sound to pinpoint your location after their initial hit. Other cool thing about Calm Spirit is that it chains well with so many of other perks on multiple survivors, not just Jake. Using a combination of Calm Spirit, Iron Will, Quick and Quiet, and other perks like Dance With Me or Lightweight make it really hard for killers to track you after they hit you, unless they're really paying attention to where you go or have a keen eye for tracking your blood. Some of the other cooler things you can do is even by spinning around inside of the killer themselves after hitting them. If they're not paying 100% attention to what's going on, it's a lot easier for them to spin themselves around because they're not sure where you've gone, and again, you didn't make a noise when you got hit. Now, admittedly, I don't think Calm Spirit is like a huge game changer, at least not by itself, but it can be very useful in certain situations, and again, it does have builds like the one I'm showcasing now that make it extremely powerful, especially versus Nurse or Spirit. last on the list for survivors is going to be a perk called Poise. Poise is one of Jane Romero's teachable perks. It is our second perk that you'd pick up in our blood web, so you'd get this at level 35. And what this perk does is anytime a generator is popped on a map, you gain the ability to create no scratch marks for the next 10 seconds. Now, this perk can be really clutch in some situations, but the weakness of this perk, in my opinion, is the fact that you don't necessarily control when it happens. The perk is probably really useful later in the game when there's less survivors up, when you're working on a generator. It does help you kind of make a clean escape if the killer's on their way down right as you finish the generator. And if a generator pops mid-chase, there are some really cool plays you can make with this to lose the killer knowing that you no longer create scratch marks. It kind of opens a window of opportunity, if you would, to make a couple of key plays or some quick split-second decisions to actually get away. Now, like many other perks that I've talked about earlier, Poise does work and synergize really well with a lot of other perks in the game. For example, running a build very similar to what I was speaking about earlier with Jake's Iron Will, running a build like, say, Poised, Iron Will, Quick and Quiet, can again help make for quick getaways mid-chase should a generator get popped while you're running away. This can also be really great in the endgame scenario if you're being chased by the killer at the end and you happen to have adrenaline. Having the speed boost along with the removed scratch marks gives you the ability to make a great distance without the killer being able to track you unless they're in line of sight. Now, it's time for my picks for which perks I would get from the shrine if I were you. Personally, I feel like if you're a killer main or if you're playing killer right now and you're trying to level up your killers or do better there, I would personally go for Strider. Strider is actually a very underrated tracking perk and can be a sleeper hit on just about any killer. A lot of people expect it on Nurse and even on Spirit, but running it on other killers can be really strong, especially if the survivors don't see it coming, and can help you in a lot of clutch situations where you're trying to find players and they don't have Nurse's Calling. Another thing too is obviously a lot of players predict or expect Nurse's Calling, so running Strider over that when they refuse to heal themselves can also help you a great deal in being able to find the players. Although I do, like as I said, really like Unnerving Presence, the biggest problem with Unnerving Presence is it only truly shines on Doctor. There's a lot of other like situational builds you can make work, say with Legion or Myers, but those aren't necessarily the best builds, and more importantly, even when you're using those builds, you generally want another perk in its place. If you're planning on being a Doctor main or picking up Doctor, I would highly recommend checking out the perk, but otherwise, I just level up Trapper or pick this up next time it comes around. Now I'm coming to the survivor side. To be completely honest, I have the least amount of experience with Poise in this situation, so by default, I'd probably have to go with something like Calm Spirit. Just because Calm Spirit has so many applications, can be useful even on its own, but is also incredibly strong when used in tandem with things like Iron Will and Quick and Quiet. Although it does take a very high level of skill to execute those plays properly, I do feel like Calm Spirit is probably the stronger out of the two, simply because it's far more reliable in a chase. Poise, I think, can be really strong, and in the little time that I've used it, I have made some pretty amazing plays, but again, this would come with a lot more understanding of how to use the perk and how to make the most of the perk when it's activated. One of the biggest things about Poise that, I say, lemons it compared to, say, Lightweight or Dance With Me, is that you don't get to control when it activates. It pretty much just kind of activates, and you have to make your best of it when it does. The other thing too is while Lightweight is uptime is pretty much the entire game, and Dance With Me you can activate almost every 40 seconds, Poise you will only get 5 of every game. The main reason for that obviously is because there's only 5 generators and the perk only activates when a generator gets finished. Now that doesn't mean that you can't make more use out of it, and it's very likely an experienced player will probably get more use out of Poise than, say, a traditional Dance With Me. But until you learn how to play at that level, I think it's probably something I'd wait for a little bit later in my game plan. That's going to do it for today's video about Shino's Shrines pick, but I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions about this, you're more than welcome to stop by my stream and ask me. I stream just about every night, Monday through Friday. We talk about Dead by Daylight, anime, and just about anything else in between. So if any of that catches your attention, feel free to stop by. Until then, I'll see you guys next time. Deuces.
Run.
Relax, bro. It's a prank. Look, bro. It's a prank, bro. It's a prank, bro. Look. Fucking.
Nice.